Hey church, welcome to Truth in 10. This week I want to talk about Bible translations because I've got this question a couple times and why do I preach from the CSB? What do I read? And so I thought I'd just fill you in on my thoughts on this. And just a disclaimer, I am not the manuscript guy. I haven't done like all the intense research of which manuscripts come from where and this kind of thing. I know people who have gone down that rabbit hole. I have not, but I've done some research and I do have some thoughts on how we can pick a good translation to use. And I just want to say too, first, some people get on this like, there's got to be the one translation that's the best. And the way I look at it is, do I think God is like, worrying about his church right now? Say there's 5 top translations, right? Like imagine if they're, the 5 most popular. Does God say, oh no, like I can't believe this one is used by people? And I really don't think that's how it is. I don't think there's one that God's like, that is the best English translation, and anyone who doesn't use it is, kind of lesser or missing out on something. I don't think choosing this translation or that, as long as they're good translations, I don't think that means we're going to miss out on something because we chose this, translation over that. So, however, what I do think is we can make some good decisions based on some good information. So, one really helpful concept that was brought forward by a linguist named Eugene Nida is the idea of dynamic versus formal equivalence. And I think this is really helpful when it comes to translation for how we think about it. So dynamic equivalence is like one end of the spectrum, kind of one end of the continuum. And dynamic equivalence is almost trying to get some people call it thought for thought. That is, we're trying to look at the original language and translate it into another language, but we're trying to mostly bring out the meaning, right? Because you could bring out words, word for word, but you might miss the meaning, and it's helpful to think of things like, when we have a play on words in English, you might try to translate that over to French, and it doesn't make any sense because it's a play on words in English. And so, the dynamic equivalence idea is basically like there's some of those things, or a lot of those things, where we're trying to translate not what they're actually specifically saying, we're trying to translate what they're meaning. And so that's dynamic equivalence. Formal equivalence is the other end of the spectrum, and that is that we're trying to get word for word what they're saying. And the extreme of that is like we're trying to get it as much as possible, which is sometimes very hard between languages, especially Greek and Hebrew to English, but we're trying to get the words that are being said, and we're not trying to put in any interpretation, we're just translating the words. Now, I would say I don't see the very end of the spectrum as helpful. I don't think we can go way over to the dynamic equivalence and we're saying we're just trying to interpret the meaning because we don't necessarily know what their meaning was. We need to find the meaning from the words. And so I don't think going way over to the almost paraphrase of the text is good. I also don't think it's good to try and do 100% word for word, because then it really doesn't become readable at all. And if something is word for word yet not readable, you're not going to get the word of God. So my philosophy, I wouldn't say it's in the middle, but it's not at either end. My philosophy would be leaning probably a decently far toward the formal equivalence while still keeping in mind readability and my ability to take in and my ability to share and teach from that text. So I do think we need the words, okay? The words that have been written down are the word of God. However, we are translating them, and so I don't think we can say every single word, in the same order that it's given has to come through in English. I don't think that will work very well. I do think readability is important, especially when you're trying to teach new Christians, when you're trying to share with children or, people who don't get the concepts, or people who can't, aren't academically inclined and aren't, good at dealing with language. So that is why I use 3 main translations. I do use some others sometimes, but my 3 main translations are the CSB, the ESV, and the NASB. So I use the CSB mostly for preaching. There's very rare times where I don't like how the CSB has translated a passage, and so I will preach from the ESV. But generally, in the last year or so, I've been preaching from the CSB, and that's the Christian Standard Bible. I like that because it is still on the formal equivalent scale. Like it's pretty high up there compared with the others. It's more on the formal equivalent side than NIV would be. It's not quite ESV, but I think it's getting pretty close. But I do like that it's very readable. They tried to make it a 7th grade reading level, tried not to use really academic language, and I do like that. Now, I will say, I don't think it's bad for the language of the Bible to be above our heads, because then it causes us to think on it. So I don't think we should say, oh, I really just need to read it, and so I'm going to find a super, super readable translation and forget the words. No, I don't think that's good. But I do use the CSB for preaching. Now, for my own reading and meditation, when I'm doing morning devotions and things like that, I use the ESV. And I like the ESV because it is a little more formally equivalent. It's a little more word for word, and I do like to dig into the Bible word by word and meditate on each word. And so I do find the ESV is a good mix of having a lot of the original words, a lot of the conjunctions and things that I think are very important for understanding the Bible, but it is still, I can still read through it and understand. Then when I'm really getting into the study, sometimes in my morning devotions I do this, but if I'm preparing to preach, I work from the NASB. And the reason I do that is because the NASB is very formally equivalent, like it's very far on the word for word. I think probably one of the top on that spectrum for English translations. But the NASB is, and that's the New American Standard Bible, and it's really good for me for working from the interlinear. So if I'm looking at the original language, Hebrew or Greek, and looking at the NASB, the words kind of it does a decent job of lining up with the words, and so that's why I use that for my study. Now, all of that said, I think that we don't need to feel pressure like, oh, I have to pick the right translation, right? And there's always those people who are really passionate about their translation. I've seen that with KJV, of course. I've seen that with ESV, with NIV. I've seen people just like, this is the translation to rule them all. I don't think it needs to be like that. They had actually translation disagreements all the way back to the early church. And you can see that even in the Bible where, not that they had conflict over it, I don't think, but some authors in the Bible quote from the Hebrew Old Testament, and some quote from the Greek Old Testament, and some quote from both. So you definitely had people who were using different translations back then, and they all made their way into the New Testament, or they both made their way into the New Testament. So I just think when we're thinking about translation, pressure's off, but we need to consider some things. One is, what am I using it for? Okay, and it's fine to use different translations for different things, but if I'm just casually, I want to read big chunks of the Bible, then maybe it's a good idea to do one of the translations that's more on the readable side, and you're not really digging in word for word in that sense. But hey, when I want to dig in word for word, is it good to use one of those really readable ones? Well, maybe not, because you might be missing some things. So what is my use? And that can help determine which translation you choose. The other really helpful thing to ask is, what helps me? What helps me get into the Word of God? Because you could pick the translation, you say, I really am all for this translation, but I go to read the Bible and it's like, oh, I chose the NASB because I really want it to be word for word, but I just can't read through it because it doesn't really flow well like you're reading a story or reading a book or anything like that. So maybe you need to think about, what is going to help me read the Word of God? What is going to help me study the Word of God? And then the last thing to think about is, again, let's not be judgmental about this, because like I said, there are lots of good translations. Maybe some that people choose are really probably unhelpful, and there are those. But if we're really thinking about this and trying to find a good balance that's helpful for us, I don't think we need to judge. And we can disagree and use our own translations and love each other in the process. So thanks for joining. This is Truth in 10, and we'll see you next time.